Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Patricia and Valerie for inviting me to speak, and also to thank the Symposium organising committee here at MFIT, who have done a fantastic job, and of course all of you for staying to the very end. Much of my talk this afternoon, am I doing this right? Yeah. Much of my talk this afternoon will consider the representation of fur in film and literature, and so I thought I'd start with C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which at the very beginning of the novel, for those of you who I'm sure are familiar with it, provides a perfect account of fur as a site of transformation, of boundary crossing, of in fact, I suppose, becoming. And we read, looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew it was very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. And fur gives way to the magical landscape of Narnia, of course. So as Lucy progresses into the wardrobe, we read, soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps. Really, I suppose what I've become particularly interested in is this idea of the sensuous appeal of fur. It's more evident in the book in a less kind of anti-fur age, where we get a much stronger description of Lucy's tactile attraction to the fur. But even in that clip, we can feel it, I think. And particularly fur as literally a doorway into the other, fur as a transformative object. Fur as a medium with the ability to transport its wearers, and indeed its hunters, far beyond conventional boundaries, has been an enduring literary trope long before C.S. Lewis's mid-20th century fantasy. Indeed, I suppose we could start with the Bible and the passage from Genesis 3:21 describing God, arguably the first farrier, fashioning garments from animal skins for Adam and Eve once they've been seen and eaten of the forbidden fruit. Their fur clothes marking their transition from holy innocence to sinful knowledge, a psychological passage signalled by the donning of fur that persists today, and which I'll return to shortly. Fur as a sort of do-it-yourself primeval fashion choice is also featured in the 1961 film version of Jules Verne's Mysterious Island. You're going to have to forgive me because I really like bad B-movie versions of great literature, so excuse me. But the film is now remembered primarily for its special effects in super dynamation, as we can see here, which include giant crabs, ostrich-like birds, and bees. Now, Lady Mary Fairchild in the film, here played by Joan Greenwood, one of the survivors stranded on the desert island that appears to have been caught in some sort of frozen or perhaps thickened time, demonstrates that not only is she a crack shot, but also in possession of remarkable needleworking skills, equaling that of God himself, perhaps. And she quickly runs up a sort of Edwardian capelet for herself and a mini dress for her niece. As the narrator informs us, Lady Mary turned out to be quite handy with a needle and thread. She was able to make goat skins into clothing for the men and fashioned a trim garment for Elena. Now, although the film bears little relationship to Jules Verne's original novel published in 1874, There Are No Monsters and No Women in the original book, Verne's quite specific location of a non-existent world and the naming of this imaginary landmass as Lincoln Island, as we can see here, after the American president, does share an affinity with, I would suggest, fur's relationship to and production of space, and as a means of frontier or boundary crossing that I've been considering in my research, and which I found increasingly useful when trying to understand the complex socio-cultural, economic, and fashionable histories of fur. Histories of fur that, judging by the recent success of The Revenant at the Oscars, or the Netflix series Frontier, or of course the ubiquitous Game of Thrones, seem to be generating a genuine, renewed popular interest in fur, despite the continued efforts of the anti-fur lobby that has not been experienced, really, I don't think, since the mid-20th century. This, coupled with a dramatic increase in the number of fashion designers, including fur in their collections, was in part my inspiration for writing the book I'm currently researching. Fur invokes sensations of limitlessness, Structurally, it is composed of thousands of individual hairs, too fine and numerous to comprehend, which in combination produce furry landscapes of lustrous beauty and tactile sensuousness. Apparently having no distinct boundaries, its furry edges promising further vistas. Similarly, fur resonates with the ferocity, primitivism, and carnality of the natural world, a world at once seductive and terrifying. The economic and cultural legacy of fur charts yet another vast, almost incomprehensible terrain of wealth, power, and sensuality. Together, these boundless plains make our experience of fur akin to that of the sublime. As Kant formulated when grappling with our reactions to the grandeur of landscape, he suggested the mind feels set in motion in the representation of the sublime in nature. And if we understand fur as a quintessentially natural object, his understanding of the mental struggle involved in comprehending the awe-inspiring in nature can similarly help us perhaps to understand our responses to fur. For, even though fashioned and manipulated into garments, the natural awesomeness of fur remains, and our response echoes Kant's mental movement, he coined this idea of mental movement, which especially, and I quote, in its inception, may be compared with a vibration, i.e. with a rapidly alternating repulsion and attraction produced by one and the same object. And I couldn't resist this beautiful Klimt painting called The Polecat Fur, where the wearer seems to literally oscillate in her fur coat against the Chinese background that Klimt was so fond of. And I've become particularly interested in how artists through the ages have struggled, I suppose, or at least aspired to represent fur and this particular quality it has of kind of attraction, sensuality, and indeed repulsion. And what else but the sublime is Lucy experiencing as she inhales and revels in her journey through fur in the wardrobe, in The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe? And surely in this remarkable spread from US Vogue of November 1977, entitled The Force of Fur, I always get that wrong, The Force of Fur, which for me has been a real key object in my research, where that season's latest fur coats were accompanied by the robots from the hit movie Star Wars, which also premiered that same month in 1977. And this collision between the very traditional, you could say almost primeval idea of fur and wearing fur with technology has been a real kind of source of inspiration for me and has been very fruitful. But here I think we can understand Jerry Hall's ecstatic expression is akin to that of the sublime, as she experiences the power of her full-length wraparound fur coat with, and I quote from the copy here, a big pull-up sable collar that puts fur where it's most appealing, all around the face. Now, Vogue's meeting between high-fashion fur and intergalactic robots is on a par with Jules Verne's fertile imaginary world. And his work, as we've seen in the exhibition, and of course in many of the speakers today, Jules Verne's shadow is very long and in fact kind of deep, I think, over this whole exhibition and the whole idea indeed of clothing and expedition. And since writing my essay for the book, Verne has continued to provide me with inspiration and proof of fur's inextricable links with exploration and boundary crossings. In his 1873 work, Le Pays de Fourrure, or The Fur Country, another, along with Mysterious Island, that I showed a clip of there, of his Extraordinary Voyages series of novels, we follow the exploits of a group of Hudson's Bay employees, astronomers, and lady adventurers as they seek to establish a trading fort some 70 degrees north of the Arctic Circle. But in typical Vernian fashion, the expedition party ends up detached from the mainland, floating on an iceberg to unknown lands, encountering avalanches, hostile and friendly natives, earthquakes, ferocious animals, and solar eclipses. Now, from the very first page of the novel, the reader is introduced to the concept of fur as adventure, as expeditionary inspiration, and as possible danger, all underwritten by a remarkably modern attitude to the fur trade and the activities of the Hudson's Bay Company, as this description of the company's outpost at Fort Reliance reveals, and he describes this interior. The interior wall, with its narrow single door leading to the adjoining room, was ornately decorated with as magnificent a display of furs as could be seen in the exclusive shops of Regent Street or Nevsky Project. It was as if every species of wild animal known to the Arctic, wolf, grizzly bear, polar bear, otter, wolverine, mink, beaver, muskrat, silver fox, ermine had contributed its finest pelts. Above, in letters artistically cut from a piece of coloured cardboard, hung the motto of the famous Hudson's Bay Company, Pro Pelle Cuten. Now, any study of fur, of course, must acknowledge the Hudson Bay's central and often problematic history, but time does not permit that today. But instead, I shall use its famous motto, Pro Pelle Cutum, translated roughly as a skin for a skin, to bring me to the last aspect of fur's negotiation of boundaries I wanted to consider. That is the boundary between inner and outer, whether that be sartorially in the form of fur as lining, as in this beautiful Balenciaga suit here with the little bit of sable lining just peeking out, or fur as an outer layer or coat. This vestimentary play between the seen and unseen, the barely glimpsed, the publicly displayed but perhaps privately experienced, is in turn, I would argue, revelatory of deeper instinctual desires. Fur's journey from outer to inner, from exterior to interior, which I discuss further in the expedition essay, provides an insistent metaphor for our collective response to and understanding of fur, evoking concepts concerning the relationship between the inner and outer layers of the body, human or animal, the expeditions into the interiors of uncharted territories, fundamental to the history of the fur trade, and the outward display of wealth and power that has determined so much of the development of fur as a fashionable material. The tension that exists between the inner and outer layers of any structure, the inherent violence associated with the skinning and wearing of animals, and the economic demarcation of society expressed by the ability to own and wear fur, is palpable when we start to journey through fashionable fur's seductive surfaces. The negotiation of this tension between inner and outer is in fact the history of vestimentary fur, and resonates with the same poetic allure that Gaston Bachelard found in his masterful exploration of space, and I quote, "Outside and inside are both intimate. They are always ready to be reversed, to exchange their hostility. If there exists a borderline surface between such an inside and outside, this surface is painful on both sides." Now, the inherent violence associated with the wearing of animal skins is, of course, a highly emotive subject and has meant that there has been little recent reasoned discussion of our ancient and sensorial relationship with fur. And it has typically been artists, perhaps, who have most successfully tackled this difficult subject. Artists such as Jean Antoni, seen performing her work Saddle, in which she kneels on the floor, covered by a wet cowhide, waiting until it dries across her body, and which then assumes her body's shape, a transformation of human into animal, asking us to consider the relationship between animal and rider, beasts of burden, the borders of power, ownership, and suffering bound up in our relationship to animals. So, if Antony's performance exposes the mundane economic tensions between human and animal, the wild and the domesticated, it is also, of course, indebted to all those magically transformative furs and skins that go to make up both the mythic and real wardrobes of fur, from Jason's golden fleece to the magical donkey skin of Perrault's fairy tale of the same name, Donkey Skin. Fabled furs provide their captors and wearers with disguise, reward, and the promise of transformation. Donkey skin, a disturbingly incestuous variant of Cinderella in Jacques Demy's film here, played with typical Gallic chic by Catherine Deneuve, conflates forbidden desire, the king for his beautiful daughter, fashionable obsession, the princess demands as her impossible dowry dresses that are the colour of the stars, the moon, and the sun, and the economic symbolism of fur. The magical donkey skin the princess, in order to escape the lecherous attentions of her father, is forced to disguise her beauty with, comes from a beast that literally shits gold. All of which distills in one disconcerting tale the erotic, fashionable, and economic resonance of fur. And of course, we all know, wearing fur can heighten, cloak, or reveal, or trouble sexuality. Fur, there we are, there's Rock Hudson, a little clip there. Fur can reveal the beast within us, from pussycat here to leopard, and lead us on towards that most troubling and closest of borders, that between human and simian, which we heard the kind of obsession and fascination with our proximity to the monkey. We heard about this morning. So powerful is fur's ability to transcend borders, to transport its wearers to undreamt of erotic and animistic territories, that the merest hint, edging or border of fur can become a potent symbol of power. I mean, one only has to recall all the ceremonial fur edgings that still demarcate our society today, as well as the epitome of fashionable, restrained, almost imperceptible chic that touch of fur gives, as explained in this 1960 UK Vogue article extolling the reserved merits of London couture. And here there's this description of the House of La Chasse, which says, "The luxury you find here is not the kind that flaunts itself in outward display, in brilliant colour or glitter. Rather, it's a controlled generosity in the handling of beautiful fabrics and furs, a refusal to skimp on workmanship or details, even unseen ones. A costume's lining may be one of its chief attractions." And I thought I'll end with another film clip, this time from a Doris Day movie, That Touch of Mink, that illustrates the power of fur, even as the title suggests, the merest touch of fur. In the movie, Day, in her battle to resist the wiles of her urbane suitor Cary Grant, constantly has to negotiate her relationship to fur, a battle between the implied immorality of accepting a gift of mink, even a touch of mink from Grant, and the corruption that implies, weighed against the powerful sensorial allure of fur, which she finally succumbs to in the Norman Norell-designed Bergdorf Goodman fashion show sequence, which becomes increasingly furry and irresistible to Day, who finally opts for the sententious and sensuous temptations of a mink lining. So I'll leave it with Doris Day, Lost in the World of Fur. Thank you.